So the Switch 2, it's kind of a surprising update in many ways. Now, Nintendo is no stranger to, pun totally intended, switching things up when they launch new hardware. Usually there's a novel new feature or two to catch the eye. This time, however, with the Switch 2, they've gone for a much more conservative approach. It's nowhere near as exciting, but choosing iteration over reinvention is also probably the right move for the current moment. When I first unboxed it on launch day, everything just felt familiar. Opening that little red box to find the hardware inside, sure, it's technically new, but after 8 years with the original Switch, we know what to expect here. Turning on the machine, complete with its strikingly similar user interface, and transferring across all of my original Switch games only added to this sense of deja vu. It's kind of like when you upgrade your phone. You're hyped for something shiny and new, but within an hour, with all your old apps back in their place, it doesn't really feel that different anymore, and like not much has changed. But that's not necessarily a bad thing though. The original Switch was such a huge success, with the hybrid form factor pretty much defining a new category. People love it. So it's probably fair to say that plenty were hoping that Nintendo, this time around, would keep the Switch train running, opting for an evolution rather than any kind of like surprising revolution. And being able to just pick up where you left off just on faster, nicer hardware, that's a big win. It might not wow you on paper, but I think a lot of people will find plenty of appeal in this defiantly familiar approach. You've got to remember that before the original Switch dropped in 2017, it was seen as a bit of a gamble. Nintendo merged its handheld and console teams and put all their chips in on this one idea. And it paid off. Big time. But as a result, over 90% of the company's revenue now comes from Switch-related stuff. So with over 150 million users already on board and in the Switch ecosystem, why shake things up? Sure, from a distance, the Switch 2 will be highly familiar territory. But get closer and you'll notice plenty of smart upgrades here. There's a bigger screen, there's a better kickstand, sturdier hardware, more power, snappier UI and higher resolution. You take all those things together and it's a solid refresh. That said, not everything's perfect. Let's start with the screen. No OLED. So if you're coming from the Switch OLED, yeah, it feels like a downgrade. But if you're upgrading from the launch Switch, like I am, it's a big step up. Side by side, it's brighter, has way better viewing angles, and the difference here is really, really noticeable. Honestly, I think even OLED owners won't be too upset. Sure, the black levels don't compare, but it's by no means a deal breaker either. This isn't the same LCD panel found in the original 2017 Switch. It's a solid screen. And honestly, once you're engrossed in a nail-biting, last-ditch effort to stay in a round of knockout tour in Mario Kart World, the screen isn't going to be the thing that stops your enjoyment. Storage is another wrinkle in the Switch 2 story. Yes, you now get 256 gigabytes built in. That's 8 times more than before. Nice. But modern AAA games are massive. Cyberpunk 2077 takes over 60 gigabytes, so you'll want more, much more. And that's kind of when you run into the SD card problem. The Switch 2 only supports newer, faster microSD express cards, meaning those SD cards that you've already got for your original Switch, they're no good here. But why does this matter? Well, gigabyte for gigabyte, the express format is dramatically more expensive. You can see here that a 1 terabyte card for the original Switch roughly costs around $80, whereas a similar capacity card in the express format is pretty much impossible to come by. And that $80 you'd be spending on the Switch, well, all that gets you now for the Switch 2 is a smaller 256 gigabyte express card. This lack of backwards compatibility on expandable storage is only a problem for now, however. These express cards are costly and tricky to come by today, and honestly, the Switch 2 is likely the first bit of mainstream consumer tech to really utilize them. But over time, once availability and costs shift, it will be a non-issue. So really, it's a pricey problem for us early adopters only. Sorry, us. Of course, talking of pricey, the machine itself is around 30% more than the original first Switch. Sure, we've got to take into account inflation and tariffs, but it's undeniable that Nintendo has priced this new machine at a higher level than folks probably expected. Now, this elevated price point will, of course, represent a barrier for some, despite what early sales figures may have you believe. Ultimately, though, it costs what it costs. Nintendo has always been firm in not taking a loss on hardware like others do. But I think the price of the hardware, when taken alongside the somewhat lackluster and also more expensive first-party software lineup from Nintendo, means some may opt to wait before jumping into this new generation. And I think that's okay. The Switch 2 is going to be with us until well into the 2030s. Yep, the 2030s. So skipping out on launch because you're not one of those that's kind of like clamoring to play as cow in Mario Kart is probably fine. And yeah, I know, the FOMO factor is real, I get that. But the lack of like a big, compelling single-player experience from Nintendo themselves on day one, such as we did with Breath of the Wild, makes it a somewhat easier pill to swallow. So yeah, come back once Donkey Kong arrives next month. Or once the library of exclusives have padded out a bit in time for the holidays. You won't have missed too much. So, screen, storage, software, and price. Those are my gripes. But let's be real, none of those are really kind of deal breakers. Most of these concerns that I've just highlighted are likely going to be a non-issue in a rather short time. However, there is one issue from the first Switch era that casts a long shadow: Joy-Con drift. It was a widespread annoyance and one that affected most Switch owners at some point. It's too early to say whether this controller defect will rear its ugly head here, but early signs don't look good. It looks like the same tech inside, but we shall see. Still, even with these lingering concerns, it's hard to ignore just how well Nintendo has refined its winning formula with the Switch 2. The handheld now has a textured finish, which makes the whole thing feel sturdier. The kickstand can hold any angle you want. The Joy-Cons connect more securely thanks to a clever use of magnets. Oh, and the Joy-Con are bigger now too, which makes them way more comfortable over the somewhat cramped experience of using them on the first Switch. Every small detail really adds up here. Under the hood, the new custom NVIDIA chip means the Switch 2 continues to deliver on the promise made by the original Switch of console-quality gaming in a handheld. Having the likes of Cyberpunk 2077 in your hands, playable anywhere, is wild. In fact, although Nintendo's own launch day offering is a tad mid, many third-party offerings such as Fast Fusion and Survival Kids are filling the gap, with the likes of Yakuza 0 and Split Fiction highlighting how this new handheld can handle more ambitious ports. Of course, playing such demanding big-budget games on the Switch 2 does eat through the battery a little quicker than I'd like, but on the whole, I'd say the battery life remains good. Not great, good. And it's probably adequate for most play sessions, but maybe bring an external battery with you when you're on the road. Okay, another thing. Game chat is a big win. It's a new feature that allows voice and video chat in-game, and it's something that Nintendo has thoughtfully implemented at a system level, removing any kind of reliance on external apps. You don't need to use Discord anymore, for example. Whereas Nintendo kind of fumbled online with the original Switch and their half-baked app approach, this time around they've kind of nailed it. In fact, it's such a solid feature that Nintendo felt confident enough to give Game Chat its very own hardware button. Now, I'm not so sure how I actually feel about them adding a button that essentially requires an online subscription to be functional, but it sure does speak to the strength of the feature and Nintendo's overall belief in it. Game Chat and the associated Game Share feature represent Nintendo finally taking online features seriously and doing so in a way which is a real boon to the core console experience. Both Xbox and PlayStation would be kinda smart to copy what Nintendo has done here. So, all in, the Switch 2 plays it safe, but delights where it matters most. And maybe that's the surprise here. In a world of enshittification, sometimes it's just kinda nice to see something just be better for a change. So, it's a small step for OLED owners, a compelling upgrade for those coming from the original hardware like myself, and a giant leap for those who skipped the Switch entirely. That group of people, they can now get in at a time where the hardware is solid, good for the years ahead, and has a vast library of games, both old and new. If you've not played any of the Switch titles and you pick up a Switch 2, you've got such an embarrassment of riches of cool, amazing software to play through. Kinda jealous. The end result here is a safe, yet more capable machine that retains everything that made the first hybrid such a hit, and enhances things where they're needed. I really dig it. It's the Switch, but ready for the next decade. All right, that's it from me. If you've got thoughts, questions, or, I don't know, want to argue about how best to wall ride in Mario Kart World, then comment down below. And if you found this useful, please consider giving the video a like, and maybe even subscribing. It really helps. I'm Chris for Overkill, and I'll see you next time.